Hello, and welcome to the Hamumu Halloween Home Horror Hoedown. I am your host, Mike Hommel.
And I'm your other host, Solely Hommel.
And we're going to take you through 31 scary movies through the month of October, like we do every year. But for the first time this year, we're going to do it entirely in audio format. We like to mix it up every year. One thing you need to be aware of is that we will be employing a truly ghoulish number of spoilers throughout all of these reviews. So if you haven't seen the movie we're reviewing, maybe don't listen to our podcast until you do. We highly recommend you check them out and watch along with us. It's going to be fun for everybody. I mean, how could it not be? So if you're ready and you've watched the movie, please step inside our lair and let's begin.
We watched the movie Tag from 2015. 2015, not 2018.
Which we watched earlier this year.
When it was in the theaters. But this Tag is a Japanese film. Mm-hmm. It is not rated. We watched it on Netflix. And it's another one with a fairly short running time. It was only 85 minutes. IMDb gives it a 6.1. Rotten Tomatoes critics give it an 83. And the audience gives it a 61.
Critics have to understand.
Right? Anytime you get something that's a little bit out there, or a whole lot out there,
yeah,
the critics have to be like, oh yeah, I totally get that. I, on the other hand, totally did not get that.
I am with you there. I totally did not get that.
So I noticed that you gave this one not just the gore and teen tags, which I think are very appropriate, and the Japanese tag, but fantasy and insane.
Yes, it's the first time we've used the insane tag this month, and I'm not sure that that's appropriate, but looking back...
It was pretty insane.
Oh, it's appropriate here. I'm just wondering if we've missed it anywhere. And I don't think so. I think The Lords of Salem is the closest to insane that we've seen so far, and it's not. So,
yeah,
we're good.
Yeah. Tell me about the fantasy tag.
That's obviously very subjective, but this movie struck me as a fantasy movie, which I'm not even sure what that means exactly, but when people are wandering into other worlds and magical stuff is happening, it's sort of fantasy. Like, I reviewed Insidious many years ago, and one of my complaints about it was, this isn't a horror movie, it's a fantasy movie. Or it wasn't exactly a complaint. Like, it starts out as horror and has a great seance scene, which is super creepy, and I really liked it. And then from there, it moves into fantasy. Like, he goes into this alternate world full of demons, but the demons are like, like the demons in World of Warcraft. They're hobgoblins and such. They're not creepy demons. It's
right.
Like a fantasy world. And this movie kind of felt fantasy to me.
Yeah, I feel like the fantasy element comes through very strongly too, because it's a Japanese film, and it sort of has that like almost anime cartoon comic book style in a lot of places. I mean, it's not any of those things, but it sort of feels like the things that are happening feel like the sorts of things that would happen in a cartoon.
Yeah, like when the teacher whips out a giant machine gun.
Right, just out of the blue. Like there's no hinting at it or anything. It's just we're in one reality and then everything clicks and we're in a completely different reality and there's never any explanation for it.
Yeah. So, the plot of this movie is, I don't know.
Let me see if I can give it a shot. So, the plot of this movie is that the main character, Mitsuko, is experiencing a lot of horrific things. And she keeps jumping from life to life. Like she's maintaining her sense of self, but she's a different person in each life.
She's a different actress, and her character name changes to Keiko and then Izumi.
Yes, and there are different people who know her and, different things happening to her and everything. And so basically, she's running her way through all of these lives and trying to figure out what's going on.
So are we.
Yeah. So this was your pick.
It was.
What drew you to this movie?
I went in search of this movie. I was trying to come up with what we should watch next, and I realized we haven't done any Asian horror this month. And that's always something we like to slip in, and it can be very interesting. So I did a search for best Asian horror movies on Netflix.
Nice.
And yeah, that's what happened.
Was this at the top of that list?
It wasn't at the top. Actually, the movie at the top was Train to Busan, actually.
Ah.
And later on the list were, I think, a couple others we've seen, but also above this on the list was something called The Wailing, which I have since last year considered watching, and the thing that puts me off of it
is that you're afraid of whales?
They spell it differently.
Oh.
Is that it is 2.5 hours long.
Ooh.
It is definitely, it's like a mystery and a ghost story, and it sounds of interest to me, but man, it's not short.
So, one of the things I've realized this month is that the time spent watching a movie is super subjective.
Yes.
Because the shortest films that we've watched, Tag and Ride, what is the one I'm thinking of? 11 minutes, yep. And the very shortest one, The Eyes of My Mother, have all been the movies that felt the longest to me.
Yeah.
Like
so.
Last night, I was surprised when we were looking it up after we finished, trying to figure out what on earth we missed, and I realized how short it was, because it felt like a fairly long movie to me.
Yeah, well, I think that's not like it that it was boring, it's that so much happened in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it was that happened, but there was tons of it, and that's the kind of thing that can make something feel really long. I've noticed that with like TV shows and stuff too, where some shows would just have a couple things happen, and you're like, oh, they dragged it out a whole bunch, and it can be boring, but not take that long. And then other things, if there's 10 different sequences over the course of this hour show, it's kind of exhausting.
Yeah, I actually felt like this movie was exhausting. And I don't know that I necessarily mean that in a negative way. Just that between all of the different things that were happening and how confusing it all was, and how I was really having to stay engaged, and part of it was that it was subtitles, so I was having to read everything. I tend to listen to movies a lot, and then look up when I need to, when I'm cued to look up. And with subtitles, you have to watch everything or you miss something, right?
Yeah.
So I was having to be so mentally engaged, and then she's running through so much of this movie and panting, and there were several times where I started to feel like that constriction in my chest that I get if I've been running too much and I don't have my inhaler. I'm like, I felt like I was having this exercise-induced asthma attack from watching her have to run so much.
Well, and that's, if we haven't spoiled this already, this movie is a total art film. I literally don't fully understand even the straightforward events that we watch. The plot of the movie is not clear, even beyond, symbolism and deep stuff. One of the things in the movie is this running. There are dozens of scenes of her and her friends just running. Sometimes they're running away from something, sometimes they're running for fun, sometimes they're running to get somewhere. They're just running, and it goes on for a really long time, 2 or 3 minutes of just them running through the woods.
In her Izumi iteration, she's literally running in a marathon.
Yeah,
that whole story takes place in the marathon.
They're like, we know a way to make this legitimate. Let's make it official that she's running.
Well, and I think that one of the things that our listeners should know is that this is a movie that includes a character who wears a pig's head. That's who this character is. It's a man with a pig's head, and it's not a man with a mask on. It's literally a man with a pig head
who does backflips.
Right, and it's obviously very symbolic, because up until the very end of the movie, he is literally the only man in the film.
Yeah, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't know where to go. There's so many things to talk about, and I don't know what any of them mean, so maybe by talking we'll figure it out. Maybe.
In our readings, one of the things that we've discovered is that people are somewhat divided on whether this movie, whether it's super hateful toward women or whether it's a feminist masterpiece. People seem to feel very strongly one way or the other, and I think it is one or the other, but I'm not entirely sure which.
Well, it's so strange because, I mean, there's definitely, like, there's a whole sequence where, for some reason, the wind is acting weird today, and what it's doing is blowing up all these girls', Catholic school uniforms up, or Japanese school uniforms up.
Right. It's a like a Japanese boarding school, all girls boarding school, and the wind keeps flipping up their super, super short skirts so that you see their white underwear.
And that's either exploitative or it's a commentary about the issue of this kind of exploitation. And I lean in that direction.
The commentary?
Yes, I'm not super sure like other people are, but I'm leaning that way in part because almost the entire movie there is not one man in the movie, and that means something. That
right.
And
the overall story itself is one of women being subjectified. I mean, major spoilers here, you guys. Like, definitely, if you're thinking about watching this movie, go watch it before you go any further. It all boils down to the fact that she's actually a character in a video game, and
or at least that's something we learn anyway.
Right, and that it's a man who programmed it, and it's
a man who's playing it,
and a man who's playing it, and basically the world outside this video game is all men. Mm-hmm. I mean, it when we got to that part, it actually said on the screen, "Man World."
Yeah, just Man World.
So, like, that piece of it, and the fact that she wins in the end, sort of.
Well, she takes control of her circumstances, and I mean, she smashes up that pillow,
right,
and possibly kills the guy, but maybe not.
Right.
No.
So at the end, the last thing I wrote was she has escaped.
Well, you know what she does to escape at the end? She
right.
kills herself in the real world, I guess, and in each of the video games, all three parts, she kills herself.
So, but like you said, she takes control of her life after having been a pawn in this game. So that makes me lean toward everything else is very intentionally set to make some kind of point about feminism or toxic masculinity or misogyny or whatever. But it's such a fine line.
People complain about the lurid scenes, but that's really not a big part of it. In the beginning it is. It's the schoolgirls, and she goes to school, and the wind is whipping up their skirts, and repeatedly and pointedly they'll like fall on the ground and you can see their underwear, like for no reasonable reason, but it's happens during the course of things, and it makes you think there's probably a reason they're pointing the camera like that. But for most of the movie that's not a thing. Like, then she's an adult in a wedding dress, which is just whatever, and although at the wedding everyone else takes off their clothes, which
it goes from like
weird.
this cheering supportive crowd to suddenly being very aggressive and very they like take all their clothes off and they're like screaming instead of cheering, and there's definitely a transformation.
Man, that wedding.
But I feel like there's an element of that same sense of taking control within that. Like, even, the flashing of the underwear and stuff is like, I don't know, that the like something about, if you take men out of the equation, then is it really that big a deal?
I mean, we're watching the movie, so...
Yeah.
That's... I don't know.
And if they're choosing... I mean, the wind isn't a good example of this because it's not a choice, but if they're choosing, like at the wedding, the women all take their clothes off, it's a choice thing. No, they're not being forced to do it, except then we find out they're in a video game, so maybe they were...
Possibly.
I don't know.
I mean, there's something to, like, we need to analyze this wedding scene, because the wedding scene particularly makes no sense as anything other than a piece of art. Like, look at this, what does it all mean? Every part of it is symbolic, no part of it is literal. It's nothing except something symbolic. So she shows up at this wedding that she doesn't want to be at or doesn't even know anything about. She's got a broken bottle instead of flowers. She is being cheered on by a crowd of entirely women, and there's not one man at the wedding. she's walking up the aisle to a coffin instead of a groom, which she knows something bad is in the coffin and she's nervous. And then the crowd starts taking off their clothes and switching from cheering her to screaming at her and mocking her and laughing at her. And they're pushing her forward towards the coffin. And then they open it up, and there's a pig man inside, and they're like, kiss him, kiss him.
And he's like, his face is all bloody and stuff.
Yeah, it's real gross. She didn't want to kiss him for some reason. What does any of that mean?
So there's another element to that wedding, the whole idea of the wedding even, in that when she's at the boarding school, she's very clearly in a romantic relationship with one of the other girls, who is the girl who shows up in all of the different stories.
Yes, that seems really important.
And so, like, just the fact that she's in this wedding, I mean, even if it was a man, she wouldn't have wanted to be in this wedding because she's not attracted to men, is the impression that I was getting.
Yeah. One of the things I read, one of the people's interpretations of this movie was entirely about that. He's like, this is about how hard it is to come out in Japan and how, this is not good for her.
You know what? That makes a lot of sense to me, because then the wedding scene, so all the other women, they're so excited for her to get married. Like, even before she gets into the chapel, like, all the friends are, like, hysterical almost at this, oh, she's here and she's going to be a wedding. They're, like, squeaking and squealing and they're all excited. And they don't seem to have any sense of what her emotions are about it. They don't care, frankly, really what she thinks. And they are just so excited that there's a wedding happening. And then the audience, all the people, all the guests who were at the wedding seem to sort of feel the same way when she first walks in. And then as she's like slow, being slow and maybe some of the hesitation and everything, that's when they start to turn. Yeah. And they start to force her toward it. And so, it kind of makes sense that, like, the whole idea of, even culturally, but more specifically, the women in the culture are not supportive of this idea. And I don't know, I don't know anything about Japanese culture. So it's, I'm not, like, making an assessment of how Japanese culture approaches being gay or lesbian, but that's kind of an interpretation of that scene, I guess.
Yeah, it's all symbols. Whole stupid movie. Nothing makes sense. But what does it mean? So, I mean, they explain, that there's one scene of exposition in the movie where the old man playing the game, like, flat out tells her, we took your DNA and made you into a game, which is kind of weird because, DNA based, so it's like it's really her in the game somehow, which is good because otherwise she would just be a character and wouldn't be able to have any of these choices. But he explains that, and that's a little too easy, so that's not what's really happening, even if that is the real plot. So I don't know, because that's one layer, and then just above that layer is the whole idea of men controlling women, since obviously that's what that's about. And then we get these other layers of whatever.
Well, what's interesting to me too is that there are only women within the game universe. There only seem to be men outside the game universe. And so when he's talking about how we took your DNA and put you in the game, like, it's sort of, I mean, it very strongly implies that at some point, all of the women in his universe ceased to exist somehow. Yeah. And he managed to save their DNA. He has this, like, glass terrarium of women, and it's not a big terrarium. Like, there's not a huge number of women in there. So I don't know, like, what happened? Like, where did the women go? Why are they gone? Why is their DNA still there? Like, did they leave? Were they all killed? Like, I don't know.
I have very few concrete thoughts. One thing I came up with when she was Izumi running the race, and then she went into this cave and found a bunch of ring girls, which is to say the girl from the ring multiple times over. With
the hair over the face.
Yeah. And there was a leader to them. I forget, it was like one of her friends, I think. And she said, we have to kill you because when you live, we all die. And it all revolved around her, and her surviving was the death of all of them. And they wanted to flip that around because they kind of didn't like that. And at that point, I wrote down that this whole thing is like a nightmare escape for her of her feeling survivor's guilt over being the only survivor of the bus crash, thinking of a real bus crash, not the wind slicing the bus in half. Like, that part was also symbolic. And so this idea that it kind of fit up to that point to a certain degree, that all of this was just her feeling guilty for surviving when everyone else died. But it doesn't.
No, and I don't think that's what it was, because I don't think the bus crash was within the game.
Definitely.
So I was sort of thinking something along the same lines.
Sweet.
I was expecting that it was going to turn out that all of this, like all the fantasy elements of it, were her mind processing things. Like that she had experienced a trauma and that she was trying to figure it all out. And, you know, the man with the pig head, and then she ends up in this like really dark, kind of under a bridge sort of feeling place, like the cave area where she meets the ring girls. Sort of felt like a slummy part of town under a dirty bridge. Yeah. And I felt like we were maybe getting pieces of she had some kind of sexual trauma and was trying to process all of that. And that, you know, she was eventually going to put all the pieces together and find out. And then at the end, when here's this bed and this very handsome, almost naked boy, and, you know, you need to get in the bed. And I was like, oh, here's where, this is the guy. Like, this is where it happens.
That sounds pretty cool.
But I don't think that that's what it was. And I'm really glad, because, I mean, we've talked about this before, that is so often the vehicle of any heroic woman's story. Like, that she has to be physically traumatized in order to have the strength and whatever. You could argue that being a pawn in a video game played only by men is not that far off of that. But I was glad that it didn't turn out to be that.
You know, the alligator fits in your story very well.
Yes.
But I just, man. So we've developed like 5 or 6 different theories of what this movie could be about. And who knows what it is.
I suspect that the director or writer, his name is the writer's Yusuke Yamada. That was like a graphic novel or a...
Yeah, he based it on that and apparently made it very different from Yamada's novel. And
so he being Sion Sono, who also directed it and is a famous director. Obviously, we're not in the know, but is a famous director. I believe that he knew what he was trying to say with this movie. Like, I believe
think he did.
The artistry of this movie. We've talked before about how there are some movies where they're just like, if I just throw a bunch of paint at the walls, someone will think it's a you know, really expensive painting.
Yep.
But I feel like this is true art. And part of that is that I think you're supposed to try to figure it out and bring your own interpretation to it and you know, feel things from it, and not necessarily, like, there's not necessarily an end point he was trying to get us to.
I wonder, like, I'm trying to imagine how you would make something like that other than to just throw Jell-O-covered spaghetti noodles at the wall. And that's so weird to think about. Creating something, I mean, of course he had an intent, but creating something and making sure it's open-ended enough that people can interpret it. And that's just crazy, because then there's not enough there for your interpretation of it, you know? It's like you're throwing away the story you're trying to tell in order to broaden it out to the point where it's just confusion.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, you know, I suspect that all the pieces in there have meaning to him.
Oh,
like,
sure.
he knows, but he doesn't seem to be super tied into making sure his audience picks it up. It reminds me very much of watching the This Is America video. By
Childish Gambino.
Yes, by Childish Gambino, where you know everything has a purpose in that video, but he doesn't consider it his problem to make sure that everyone understands what all that purpose is.
Yeah, that's definitely the same kind of art, where it's highly detailed but unexplained.
So it also reminds me of Sorry to Bother You, which we saw in theaters recently. Yeah, that same...
Yeah, same kind of horsemen instead of pigmen.
Right, but everything means something.
Yeah.
And it's up to you to figure out what that is.
And yet, with those things, I felt so much less lost. Of course, I'm from America, so that fits.
Right. Now, both of those, I definitely had an element of feeling lost because they are both very much about Black culture in America, and that's not something that I have a lot of experience with, so it's harder for me to interpret things and to pick up on the cues. And it's the same with the Japanese film. I don't understand all the references and all the social cues and all of those things that make it understandable. Which honestly is one of the things I like about watching Asian horror, is that it is so far removed from the norm of what I'm used to that it's often scarier for me because it's more unexpected. It's less familiar.
Speaking of unexpected and unfamiliar, that was a problem I had with this movie, is this artsiness of it. It kind of ended up to where, Mitsuko had no idea what was going on the whole movie. She was just terrified and running around. And then Aki clearly did know what was going on and was trying to help her and guide her without actually explaining anything. And it kind of made it so that there wasn't something to grasp onto. Like, I couldn't follow the story because we weren't a party to the story. Aki's standing there going, "You've got to pull these cables out of me," in the most gross scene ever. And she's like, "Why would I do that? How is that good?" And she's like, "You just have to do it." And so finally she did, after a lot of complaining, and it opened a door. But why?
So one of the things I noticed when the door was open was that, like, she pulled there was a red cable and a blue cable, one coming out of each arm. And she pulls them and, like, tears Aki apart. And then you can see the two cables, like, as she's walking toward the door, you can see the two cables that are clearly coming from Aki. But then there's also a whole collection of cables just laying on the ground. There's, like, a pile of them, which wasn't ever really explained. And at this moment, the way I want to interpret that is that she's not the first person to have done this, or the first woman to have done this and to have escaped from this game. And it makes me wonder if Aki isn't in there of her own volition, maybe, because she's the same person in each story. Like, she's not changing up her face like Mitsuko was. So, is that what's happening? Like, they get out and then they come in and they help somebody else get out? Is it sort of a Matrix kind of thing?
There's a whole lot of Matrix kind of thing to this movie, for sure. And that makes sense. When I think about, when you first mentioned the lines on the floor, which I noticed them, but I didn't really think about them, I was thinking about the rows and rows of ring girls back there. So she tears Aki in half, and all of them are torn in half too, and the cables run from everybody, and I don't know what that means.
And that could be it too. I don't know either.
But that's just what makes it so hard to follow. Like, there's not a straightforward something. It's just a bunch of scenes. And they're only connected by the fact that she runs from one to the next.
Yeah. Well, there were other connections. The wind connected through. The pillow. There was definitely a motif of feather pillows, which, I really feel like Hollywood needs to, well, it's not Hollywood, it's Japanese film, but, like, filmmakers in general need to maybe consider finding a different pillow manufacturer.
Yes.
Because TV and movie pillows are some of the weakest things I've ever come across. Like, I, in my whole life, have never had a pillow burst open and spew feathers all over.
Yeah. It's pretty common, though, in movies.
It happens all the time. Of course, so do pillow fights and...
Okay, and speaking of this pillow fighting, in one case, when they were down by the lake, they were pillow fighting with a gross hobo pillow. Ew.
Well, when you need to have a pillow fight, you can't be picky.
I guess.
Yeah, but that motif of the feathers that came out of the pillow, like that followed through, along. Like during cutscenes, the feathers would be drifting down.
Yeah,
at the
all
end,
over the place.
That's like the turning point is when she kind of flashes back to that scene with the pillow fight by the lake, and a feather lands on her finger that's bleeding, and it turns red. Which
means something, definitely.
And then all the feathers coming out of the pillow that she was using to attack the boy, like, I guess. And not in an actual attacking sort of way, like suffocate him. Like, there's damage that can be done with a pillow. Nope, she's pillow fighting with him.
Yeah, well, not really though. She was mostly just tearing the pillow apart, and you couldn't see him anymore because of all the feathers.
Yeah, that's true. But then all those feathers turn red.
Yeah,
which I kind of took as symbolic of she had killed him.
Well, and then when she stabbed herself, red feathers went flying everywhere.
Yeah.
It all means something, Soli. It all means something.
Maybe it means that the programmers of that game had some issues.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like a bug if you program blood and it comes out as feathers.
Yeah. So particle systems are tricky to code, for sure.
They are. I mean, I think we could talk about this movie for a very long time, which is probably a positive thing. And I don't think I'm ever going to get to feeling like I know what I'm talking about with this movie.
I was counting on you, and you did not pull through for me.
I'm sorry. Oh, hey, you know what we didn't talk about? Our first shot, first line.
Oh, and what was that?
Well, the first shot was a helicopter shot looking down on a road going through the woods, and you see a bus come around the corner and travel on the road, and then, we get down and that bus gets vigorously chopped in half, which was a little traumatic for me. But then the first line is after we've watched the buses travel a little bit, and we jump to inside the bus, and it's all of these Japanese schoolgirls, talking and being excited and having their conversation. And the first piece of conversation that the subtitles translated was, "Have you tried gelato?"
Which means something, Sully.
Probably. I don't know.
Maybe.
They were then having a conversation about, what gelato was and whatever.
Yeah, they were.
So, I don't know. Ratings. So, I have to rate this movie first.
Get on it.
I don't know what to do.
It's a mystery.
So, I can definitely see how people will be divided over this movie.
Oh, definitely.
People who watch this movie are either going to hate it or love it, I think. I don't think you're going to end up in the in-between a whole lot. I could be wrong about that. I think I loved it.
Oh, yeah?
I do. I don't understand it at all.
Me neither.
But it's I don't understand it, and I want to keep thinking about it and trying to figure it out, and I definitely got a feeling from it. It's like looking at a Mondrian painting. I like his art, and I recognize it as art. And I know a lot of people look at it and they're like, well, I could put some blocks of color on a canvas, and what's so special about him? But it's about the composition, and it's about balancing things in such a way that it makes people want to keep looking at it because they feel something, right? Yeah. Whereas there are lots of things, I've seen lots of things on the walls of museums and art galleries that to me just look like somebody threw a bunch of paint at the wall, and it doesn't make me feel anything, and I'm like, whatever, I could totally do that. We watch these horror movies, and there are times where we get to the end and I'm like, I do not understand what just happened. I fully think that I could make a movie that was equally as confusing and ridiculous.
Yeah.
And then there are movies like this where I'm like, I don't understand what's happening, and there is no way that I could ever create something that made people feel things and think about things the way this movie made me feel and think about things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so.
So, as much as I don't really know how to explain why, I am going to give this movie a 5.
What? You're one of those critics.
No, because I'm not. I mean, maybe. But I'm not giving it because I think I understand it in all its wonder and glory.
Look like you understand it.
Not at all, because I'm very clearly saying I have no idea what's going on. But I like the not knowing what's going on. I like the way it makes me want to know what's going on. Instead of making me go, well, that was dumb, and turn something else on. Right? Yeah, I'm giving it a 5. I feel like this was an artistic, horrific, interesting movie. I'm giving it 5 feather pillows out of 5.
It's shocking.
I can tell you're shocked.
Well,
what is your score?
Coming here from Man World, I can tell you that I am one of those mythical middle-of-the-road people.
They don't exist.
Because I enjoyed the movie. While I was watching it, I was feeling entertained and was willing to go along with it and was taking the ride. But also, it bothered me that that I couldn't interpret it and that I wasn't getting something out of it, basically. I don't know that I have the same thing you did where I feel like it made me have feelings. It's more that it was this big puzzle, and I'm frustrated that I couldn't solve the puzzle. And I had fun along the way, but was let down in the end. And also, I'm just let down in general when the answer is it's a video game. Because that's not what video games are like. It always makes me mad. Like, it's just... And like, what
This
game?
movie wasn't realistic for you. The ending wasn't realistic enough for you.
Exactly. You know, what game are you playing where you switch between a girl running away from slicey wind to somebody at a wedding... Or, wait, to an army of kids running away from teachers with machine guns, to a wedding where you have a big brawl with everybody there, to running a marathon. Woo! Let's do that one.
The funniest part about that is we actually see him playing the game, and it switches from character to character,
like on the fly,
and from story to story.
Yeah.
And it's just footage of the movie. Like, there's no actual, like...
Well, it's like one of those Dragon's Lair games where you just have to hit the button at the right time and she'll either roll away and survive or end up getting smacked.
Maybe.
It's one of those.
I don't know.
It's what do they call? Laserdisc game.
Ah.
So, yeah. Interestingly, though, almost all of those that I mentioned were about running, so it's a game about running. It's one of those infinite runners. Those are fun games. But anyway, that puts me kind of in the middle in that it was enjoyable but let me down, and I don't feel like it was really horror. Like, obviously you kind of have to put it in that category with the extreme gore that happened, but it never really made an effort to scare you. The mystery of the slicing wind, if that had gone somewhere, that could have been a horror thing, like, what is this and why is it coming after us? But of course,
and why does it only slice sometimes?
yeah, that ended up just being another unexplained thing. So yeah, frustrating. So I want to give this something like a 3 feather pillows out of 5. Because I had the enjoyment, and I'm glad I watched it, but a frustrating experience for dumb people.
You just have to revel in your ignorance like I do. Like, just...
Yeah, I'm not good at that.
Soak it up.
No.
I have so much practice.
Oh.
All right, well, I feel like that was a not very helpful conversation, but it was fun to have anyway.
Maybe tomorrow we'll understand what we're seeing.
Maybe. I don't feel like we've had that experience in most of our movies so far.
All right. See ya.
Bye. Literally a man with a pig head.
Who does backflips.
Right, and it's obviously very symbolic.